Kang Tae-ryong is known in the high-altitude glass towers of Songdo as the Diamond Ghost, a man who is brilliantly cold, impossibly hard to break, and completely transparent about his lack of mercy. Having scrubbed his soul clean of all human connection to rule the city's tech-integrated underworld, he believes he is untouchable. However, during a torrential downpour, his armored motorcade is forced into a bypass through the city's old, forgotten district. There, he is stopped by Eun-sol, a 5-year-old girl in a tattered yellow cardigan holding a rain-ruined photograph. One sentence from her lips shatters the Diamond Ghost, forcing the man who never bows to kneel in the grime of the street. Tae-ryong must now decide if he will remain a hollow gemstone of power or risk his empire to protect the only light he has ever truly owned. Before the rain and the mud of the alleyway, Kang Tae-ryong lived behind a wall of glass and silence. His life was a perfect machine, moving with the cold precision of a clock. Every morning, he stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse in Songdo, looking down at the city as if it were a game board and he was the only player who mattered. To the world, he was the Diamond Ghost, a man you could see but never truly touch, someone who was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. His office was a fortress of white marble and polished steel. There were no family photos on his desk, no colorful mementos, and certainly no warmth. His subordinates entered his room with their heads bowed, speaking only when spoken to. In Tae-ryong's world, a single mistake wasn't just a failure, it was a reason to be erased. He ruled through an iron perimeter, a circle of rules and fear that kept everyone at a distance. He believed that if he let no one in, no one could ever hurt him again. However, there was one thing the Diamond Ghost could not hide from himself. Every morning, as he tied his silk necktie, he had to look at the mirror. There, cutting through his left eyebrow and trailing down his temple, was a jagged, silver scar. Most people thought it was a battle wound from a fight for power. They whispered stories about how he had survived an assassination attempt without blinking. But the truth was much quieter and much more painful. The scar was a permanent map of the night his heart had turned to stone 20 years ago. It was a reminder of a choice he had made to walk away from a life of love and into a life of shadows. He had traded a name and a woman for a title and a throne. Every time the weather turned cold, the scar would itch, a tiny physical ache that mirrored the emptiness in his chest. Tae-ryong would run his thumb over the rough skin of the scar, his face showing no emotion. He had spent years building his perimeter, making sure that he was the strongest, richest, and loneliest man in the city. He told himself that he was satisfied. He told himself that the ghost didn't need anyone. But as he stepped into his armored car that evening, the scar felt tighter than usual, as if it were warning him that the perimeter he had built so carefully was about to be breached by a force he could not fight with money or guns. The sun had long disappeared behind the gray clouds of Songdo, leaving the city in a cold, watery darkness. A line of 3 identical black SUVs sped through the streets, their engines humming like a low growl. This was the Diamond Ghost's convoy, a moving fortress that never stopped for anything. Inside the middle car, Tae-ryong sat in total silence, staring at the digital maps on his tablet. He had a meeting with the city's most powerful investors, and he was exactly on schedule. Suddenly, the brakes screeched. The heavy vehicles jolted to a violent stop, the tires sliding against the wet pavement. Tae-ryong's head snapped up. In his world, a sudden stop usually meant an ambush. His bodyguards immediately reached for their radios, their faces turning sharp and dangerous. "Report," Tae-ryong commanded, his voice as cold as a frozen lake. "There is something in the road, boss," the driver whispered, his voice shaking with confusion. "A person. They won't move." Tae-ryong pushed open his door and stepped out into the pouring rain. His expensive wool coat quickly grew heavy with water, but he didn't seem to notice. He walked past the front of the lead car, where the bright white headlights were cutting through the gloom. There, standing in the middle of the narrow, trash-lined alleyway, was a tiny shadow. It was a little girl. She looked incredibly small against the backdrop of the massive armored trucks. Her yellow cardigan was a bright, shocking splash of color in a world of gray and black. She was shivering, her small shoulders shaking as the wind whistled through the alley. Rain ran down her face like 1,000 tears, but she stood perfectly still, blocking the path of the most dangerous men in the city. One of the bodyguards stepped forward, his shadow looming over her. "Move, kid. You're in the way of important business," he barked, reaching out to pull her to the sidewalk. "Wait," Tae-ryong said. The word was quiet, but it acted like a physical wall. The guard immediately pulled his hand back and stepped away. Tae-ryong walked closer, his leather shoes splashing in the puddles. Usually, when he approached someone, they turned pale or looked at the ground. But this child looked straight at him. Her eyes were wide and filled with a deep, bottomless sadness that felt strangely familiar. She wasn't an assassin or a rival gang member. She was just a child, yet she had managed to do what no enemy could. She had forced the diamond ghost to stop in her tracks. The air felt thick and heavy. Tae-ryong stood just a few feet away from the girl, the rain splashing between them. The high-tension silence of the alleyway was broken only by the sound of the girl's soft, ragged breathing. She reached into her pocket, her tiny hand trembling, preparing to show him the object that would change everything. The rain continued to beat down on the alleyway, but for Kang Tae-ryong, the world had gone silent. He watched as the little girl's trembling fingers reached into the pocket of her soaked yellow cardigan. She pulled out a small object, shielding it from the downpour with her tiny palms. It was a photograph, protected by a thin, wrinkled piece of plastic. With a shaky hand, she held it up toward him. Tae-ryong didn't want to look. Every instinct told him to turn around, get back into his warm car, and drive away into the safety of his glass towers. But something about the girl's eyes, the way they sparkled with a desperate hope, pulled him forward. He reached out, his large, scarred hand hesitating before he took the damp picture from her. As he looked down, the diamond ghost felt a sharp crack in his chest. The woman in the photograph was sitting in a field of wild flowers, her hair caught in a gentle breeze. She was laughing, her eyes crinkling in a way that had once been the only light in Tae-ryong's dark world. It was Soo-jin. She was the woman he had promised to protect 20 years ago, before he had chosen the path of power and shadows. She was the only person who had ever loved him for who he was, not for what he owned. He had spent 2 decades telling himself she didn't exist anymore. He had buried his memory under layers of ice and expensive suits. He had convinced himself that she had moved on and forgotten the boy with the silver scar. But here she was, frozen in time, smiling at him from a piece of paper that had been folded and unfolded 1,000 times. Tae-ryong's thumb brushed against the plastic. He realized the photograph wasn't just old, he was loved. Someone had held this picture every night. Someone had looked at it while crying. He looked from the woman in the photo to the little girl standing in the mud. The resemblance was undeniable. The girl had Soo-jin's soft chin and her brave, stubborn expression. The iron wall Tae-ryong had built around his life didn't just break, it shattered. The expensive watches, the armored cars, and the high-rise offices suddenly felt like heavy chains. For the first time in 20 years, the diamond ghost wasn't looking at a target or an obstacle. He was looking at his own heartbeat, standing in the rain in a yellow cardigan. His breath hitched in his throat as he realized that the ghost haunting this alleyway wasn't Soo-jin, it was him. The cold water of the puddle soaked through his expensive trousers, but Kang Tae-ryong did not feel the chill. As he knelt in the dirt, the alleyway seemed to stretch and grow until the skyscrapers of Songdo vanished. He was no longer a powerful boss sitting on a throne of glass, he was a man sitting in the mud, and for the first time in 20 years, the diamond ghost felt completely human. The weight of 2 decades pressed down on his shoulders like a mountain. He thought about all the nights he had spent in his silent penthouse, staring at the city lights and feeling proud of his power. He had believed that being hard as a diamond made him successful. He had thought that by cutting off his feelings, he had become a god. But as he looked at Unsol's small, muddy shoes, he realized he had actually been a coward. He hadn't built an empire, he had built a very expensive cage. Every lie he had told himself began to crumble. He had told himself that Soo-jin was better off without him. He had convinced himself that his world of violence was no place for a family. But the truth was simpler and much uglier, he had been afraid to be a hero. He had been afraid to be the man she deserved. Instead of staying to fight for a life of love, he had run away to a life of shadows, leaving a brave woman to raise a child alone and tell stories of a hero who never came home. The silver scar on his face throbbed with a dull ache. It wasn't just a mark from a fight anymore, it was the mark of his greatest failure. He imagined Sujin's voice, the way she used to laugh, and the way she must have looked at Eun-sol every day, searching for a trace of the man she once knew. She had kept his memory alive in this little girl's heart even though he had done everything possible to kill it on his own. He felt a deep, burning shame that no amount of money could wash away. He was the most feared man in the city, yet he was weaker than the 5-year-old girl standing in front of him. She had traveled through the dark and the rain to find a man who didn't want to be found. She had more courage in her pinky finger than he had in his entire body. Tae-ryong closed his eyes, letting the rain wash over his face. The throne he had spent his whole life building was gone, replaced by this moment in the dirt. He realized that the diamond ghost had died the moment Eun-sol spoke. What was left was just a man, broken, messy, and finally ready to try and find his way home. The silence in the alleyway was broken only by the hum of the running engines and the steady rhythm of the rain. Tae-ryong's bodyguards stood like statues, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had seen their boss order hits without blinking. They had seen him walk through fire. But they had never seen him touch the ground. To see the diamond ghost kneeling in a puddle was like seeing a mountain crumble into the sea. Slowly, Tae-ryong reached out. His large, tattooed hands that had only ever known how to take, gently scooped Eun-sol up. She felt as light as a feather and as fragile as glass. As he pulled her close, she wrapped her small, cold arms around his neck and buried her face in his shoulder. The warmth of the child against his chest feels a shock through his body. It was a feeling more powerful than any weapon he had ever held. "Let's go," Tae-ryong said. His voice was no longer a cold whisper, it was thick and heavy with a new kind of strength. He didn't wait for the door to be opened. He walked to the middle SUV, shielding Eun-sol from the wind with his own body. He sat in the back seat, holding her tightly as the convoy sped away from the old district and back toward the gleaming glass towers of Songdo. When the cars pulled into the underground garage of his headquarters, the atmosphere changed. This was a place of steel, cameras, and men in dark suits who never smiled. As the elevator doors opened on the top floor, a dozen of his high-ranking lieutenants stood waiting, ready to report on the night's business. They were prepared for the cold, silent leader who usually ignored them. Instead, the elevator doors opened to reveal a sight that stopped their hearts. Tae-ryong stepped out, his expensive suit ruined by mud and soaked with rain. But he wasn't looking at them. He was looking down at the little girl asleep in his arms, her yellow cardigan standing out like a bright flame against his dark coat. He walked right past his shocked men, his footsteps echoing in the marble hallway. "Boss," one lieutenant stammered, stepping forward. "The meeting. The investors are waiting." "Who is this child?" Tae-ryong stopped and turned his head slightly. His eyes were still sharp, but the icy glare was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective fire. "The meeting is cancelled," he said firmly. "From now on, no one enters this floor. If anyone raises their voice and wakes her up, they will answer me." He walked into his private office, a room that had always been a cold fortress, and kicked the door shut. The men outside looked at each other in total silence. The diamond ghost had come back, but he wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a bodyguard, and he was protecting the only thing in the world that truly mattered. Inside the quiet of his office, the bright lights of Songdo felt like distant, cold stars. Tae-ryong sat on his leather sofa, still holding Eun-sol as she slept. Her breathing was steady now, a soft sound that filled the room more than any music ever could. On the glass table in front of him sat the weathered photograph and a small, soggy backpack he had taken from the car. With a heavy heart, Tae-ryong opened the bag. Inside was a small envelope addressed to the man with the silver scar. His fingers shook as he tore it open. The handwriting was Sujin's, elegant and soft, just as he remembered. As he read the letter, the silence of the room felt like it was crushing him. The letter told the story of the life he had missed. Sujin had never been angry with him. Instead of hating him for leaving, she had spent 20 years loving the version of him that he had tried to kill. She wrote about how she had worked 2 jobs to keep Eun-sul happy, and how every night, she told the little girl stories about a brave man who was out protecting the world. She had died only a month ago from a long illness, her last wish being for Eun-sul to find the hero who had simply forgotten his way home. Tae-ryong looked at his daughter's peaceful face. He realized that while he was building walls of glass and diamond, Soo-jin was building a bridge of hope. He could have been there for the first steps, the first words, and the quiet rainy nights. He could have been a husband and a father instead of a ghost. The power he had fought so hard to suddenly get felt like a handful of dry sand. He had thought he was winning at life, but he had actually been losing everything that mattered. The diamond ghost looked at the expensive paintings and the high-tech gadgets in his office and felt sick. He had traded a warm home for a cold museum. He had traded real life for a long, lonely dream. He realized that Soo-jin hadn't sent Eun-sul to him so he could save the child, she had sent her so the child could save him. A single tear fell onto the letter, blurring the ink. Tae-ryong leaned down and pressed his forehead against Eun-sul's. He whispered a promise into the quiet air, a promise to Soo-jin's memory. He was done being a ghost. He was done hiding behind the silver scar. He didn't know how to be a hero yet, but for the first time in 20 years, he finally knew which way was home. Word spread through the dark corners of Songdo faster than the rain flooded the gutters. By midnight, every rival gang and greedy lieutenant knew the diamond ghost had cracked. They whispered that the man of iron had gone soft, distracted by a child in a yellow cardigan. To them, Eun-sul wasn't a daughter, she was a target, a weakness they could use to pull Tae-ryong off his throne. The attack came just as the city lights began to flicker in the early morning fog. A group of masked men, sent by a rival family, bypassed the main gates and stormed the private elevator. They thought they would find a distracted, weeping man. They thought the diamond ghost was dead. They were wrong. Tae-ryong heard the soft click of the door long before it opened. He didn't move from Eun-sul's side, but his entire body changed. The sadness in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, terrifying focus. He didn't look like a man who had lost his way, he looked like a lion standing over his cub. He gently tucked the blanket around Eun-sul, ensuring she was shielded from the sight of what was about to happen. When the doors burst open, the invaders didn't find a weak man. They found a storm. Tae-ryong moved with a speed that challenged his age. He didn't use a gun, he used the raw, shaking fury of a father who had just found his reason to live. He intercepted the first man at the threshold, his movements silent and devastating. One by one, he neutralized the threat, his face a mask of iron that looked even scarier than before. You thought she was a weakness, Tae-ryong hoisted, his voice vibrating with a power that made the last standing rival drop his weapon. You thought I would be easier to kill because I have something to love. He stepped over the fallen men, his shadow stretching across the marble floor until he loomed over the intruders. He didn't look like a ghost anymore. He looked like a guardian made of solid rock. Before, I fought because I wanted to win, Tae-ryong whispered, his eyes glowing with a fierce, protective light. Now, I fight because she needs to sleep. And if any of you ever bring your shadows near her again, I will show you why diamonds are the hardest thing on earth. The rivals scrambled away, retreating into the elevators with their heads down. They had come to find a flaw in the diamond, but they had found something much more dangerous, a man with a why. As the doors closed, Tae-ryong didn't celebrate his victory. He simply turned back to the sofa, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline. He sat down and watched Eun-sul breathe, realizing that being her protector was the only job he ever wanted. The morning sun finally broke through the heavy clouds of Songdo, painting the glass skyscrapers in shades of gold and soft orange. In the quiet of his office, Kang Tae-ryong watched the light dance across the floor. He was no longer wearing his expensive suit jacket. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing the tattoos on his arms that told stories of a violent past, but those stories didn't seem to matter anymore. On his desk sat the small, faded photograph of Soo-jin, now placed in a frame made of real gold. Beside it was Eun-sul's yellow cardigan. It was clean and dry now, draped over the back of a chair. To anyone else, it was just a cheap piece of clothing. To Tae-ryong, it was the most valuable thing in the building. It was a reminder that even in a world of gray and black, hope could still wear a bright, sunny color. Eun-sul woke up slowly, rubbing her eyes and looking around the big, fancy room. When she saw Tae-ryong sitting nearby, she didn't look afraid. She smiled, a small and sleepy expression that made the diamond ghost feel like his heart was melting all over again. He realized that for 20 years, he had been living for what he could own, what he could control, and what he could destroy. Now, he finally had a why. He knew the path ahead would be difficult. Leaving the underworld wasn't as easy as walking through a door. There would be more rivals, more dangers, and more hard choices. But as he reached out and took Eun-sul's small hand in his, he realized that the how no longer scared him. He didn't care how hard it would be to start over. He didn't care how much money he had to give up or how many enemies he had to face. As long as he had a reason to be a hero, he could handle anything the world threw at him. Tae-ryong picked up the yellow cardigan and helped Eun-sul put it on. He knelt one last time, but not because he was broken. He knelt so he could look his daughter in the eye. "Are you ready to go home?" he asked gently. "But I thought we were at your house," Eun-sul said, tilting her head. Tae-ryong smiled, and for the first time, the smile reached the silver scar on his face, making it look like a badge of honor rather than a mark of shame. "No," he whispered. "This was just a place where I stayed while I was lost. Home is wherever we are together." Hand in hand, the man who used to be a ghost and the girl in the yellow cardigan walked out of the office and into the light of a brand new day. The diamond ghost was gone, and in his place was a father who had finally found his way back.